Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Peace and Reconciliation, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, is again in the region on a two-week-long tour of Afghanistan, India, Pakistan and China for talks on the peace process. The pre-negotiation phase has suffered a setback because of persistent refusal by the Taliban to talk directly to the Afghan government in Kabul. Earlier today, Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi assured Ambassador Khalilzad that Pakistan would keep up efforts to facilitate the Afghan peace process. Khalilzad is accompanied by a U.S. interagency delegation representing the Departments of Defense and State and the National Security Council. Both sides discussed progress made in the peace process so far. Qureshi told Khalilzad that Pakistan's efforts to bring peace and stability to the region would remain ongoing, but that establishing peace in Afghanistan was the responsibility of all stakeholders. Meanwhile, Dr. Mohammad Faisal, the official spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was quoted as saying at the weekly press briefing that, and I quote, "India has no role in Afghanistan," unquote. The statement is in sharp contrast to what Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi had told the National Assembly last month. And he had said, since India is present in Afghanistan, its cooperation in this regard, i.e. facilitating a negotiated settlement of the Afghan conflict, will also be required. For his part, Khalilzad, on his Indian leg of the tour, met with Indian External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and informed the media that the two sides had, and I quote, discussed how to help Afghans achieve enduring peace in areas of possible cooperation, both bilaterally and regionally, unquote. In the middle of all this, Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani made a telephone call to Prime Minister Imran Khan yesterday to discuss the recent efforts for peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan. President Ghani expressed his gratitude for Pakistan's sincere facilitation of these efforts, while Prime Minister Khan assured President Ghani that Pakistan was making sincere efforts for a negotiated settlement of the conflict in Afghanistan through an inclusive peace process as part of shared responsibility. President Ghani invited Prime Minister Khan to visit Afghanistan at his earliest convenience. Prime Minister Khan reciprocated by inviting President Ghani to visit Pakistan. Both leaders also agreed to remain engaged and create an environment for resolving all outstanding issues. To discuss where the situation stands, we have with us Rahimullah Yousafzai, resident editor of the News and based in Peshawar, and with him we have Waidullah Ghazi, a political analyst based in Kabul. Rahimullah Yousafzai, what do we make of this? So I think the sticking point right now, as we also discussed sometime earlier on this program, was the fact that the Taliban are not particularly, at least at this point in time, interested in talking to the government in Kabul. That said, there is a lot of pressure on the Taliban from Pakistan and also other countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and perhaps also China to do that. So are they just assessing at what point in time should they sit down with the Kabul government?
I think apart from this issue of Taliban refusing to talk to the Afghan government at this stage, the other issue is the ceasefire. There's a U.S. demand, as far as we know, that it wants the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire to create better conditions for peace talks to go forward. And another sticking point, I think, as far as Taliban are concerned, is the U.S. refusal to commit to a timetable for withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan. So it's not only Taliban, inflexibility, which is a hurdle, but also the Americans. And Americans have a problem. They will not be able to make a commitment without involving the Afghan government in the peace talks. So I think the U.S. would want that the Afghan government, takes part in the peace talks. And then in those talks, the withdrawal of foreign forces is discussed and maybe some agreement is reached by all three parties. So I think that is the sticking point. And the Taliban are still, resisting all the pressure which is applied on them by, say, Pakistan, by the U.S., by others. The Afghan government sent a delegation led by Omer to Pakistan. We have Zalmay Khalilzad coming here for 5 days.
Yes.
Earlier he would come briefly, and this time he is spending more time.
Correct.
And then we had Lisa Curtis, we have Alice Wells, we have the U.S. and NATO military commander.
It's an interagency delegation.
So I think a lot of pressure is being applied on Pakistan and through Pakistan on Taliban.
Okay, so this is a very interesting insight. So what you're saying essentially is that while the United States wants the Taliban to talk directly with the Kabul government, they also want the Taliban to cease fire. Now, on their part, the Taliban want the US to commit to a withdrawal timetable before they actually decide on a ceasefire and whether and at what time they want to sit down across from the Kabul government. Have I understood you correctly?
Yes. I think this is how I wanted to say it. Maybe you have said it in a better way. But let me add that, the Taliban, would like this major issue to be resolved, set aside, and then they would agree, because if they agree to a ceasefire now at this stage, they won't be able to apply pressure on the US or the Afghan government to accept their demand for the withdrawal of all foreign forces. So I think they have different set of priorities, the American, the Afghan government and Taliban, and all of them are sticking to their own position.
At this point in time, let's go across to Kabul, where our friend Wahidullah Ghazi is with us. Wahidullah Ghazi, is that all view from Kabul, what Rahimullah Yusufzai just told us?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure for me. See, there is one is Taliban have pressure on Iran side and Qatar to talk with Afghan government or US and Qatar in Doha. And from other side, if they held meeting with Afghan government or US, Emirat and Saudi Arabia will not attend. That's why Taliban is in two sides, and the Taliban prefer to talk with American and Doha, not in Jeddah. That's the one issue. Inside in the Taliban, there is two groups. One is Mullah Yaqub groups. They prefer the Afghan government to talk with them. But Mullah Hibatullah group, they are against it. They don't want to talk directly with the Afghan government. But there is pressure on the Taliban to talk directly with Afghan government, but I'm sure that Taliban will talk with Afghan government, and the US will be also there, and the US, Afghan government and Taliban will talk. Because Taliban said that if we talk with the Afghan government, what we will say to our soldiers in the battlefield, it means when we talk with the Afghan government face to face, it means that we recognize the government. Then why we fought for 17 years with the Afghan government? That's why they prefer to talk with the US, because they said that our regime destroyed by US, not the current government. But without Afghan government, I'm not sure that they agree with the US. But Afghan government is one side of the conflict, and Taliban is other, and American is also other. But now we hope that they will talk with the Afghan government, and they already will talk with the Americans. But only problem is in the place whether they will talk in the
this is important, because this issue also came up last time we discussed Afghanistan, because there was a Qatari plane parked in Islamabad, and there was this issue of whether the talks are going to take place somewhere in the UAE or whether they will take place in Doha. And that is obviously, as all of us know, is because of the intra-Gulf tensions between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one side and Qatar on the other. Perhaps the United States should be able to pressure the Gulf states in order for this particular snag to be removed. But let's assume that this is resolved, whether the talks happen in the UAE or whether they happen in Doha. But the issue of at what point in time the Taliban will agree to a ceasefire will largely depend, as per Rahimullah Yousafzai, on the withdrawal timetable that the United States needs to give to the Taliban, which they have not given as yet. So, can we expect the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire and also sit vis-a-vis from the Kabul government at the negotiating table without the US giving a clear withdrawal timetable?
Yes, there is not only ceasefire, there is a lot of issues. One is the ceasefire, and Taliban will ask the US to take out their elders from the blacklist and release their friends from the jails from both sides and agree on the transitional government. But for Mr. Khalilzad have given 6-month mission to reach an agreement with the Taliban. And since 3 months, he's trying a lot, and I'm sure he will agree with Taliban and will reach to an agreement on transitional government, ceasefire, and release some friends of the Taliban and from Afghan police and Afghan soldiers from the jail of the Taliban, and will check out their friends. Or
prisoner release and swap. Rahimullah Yousafzai, there is obviously the issue of the intra-Gulf, tension, which Wahidullah Ghazi talked about. What place are they going to go to and sit together and start talking peace? There's also the issue of removing the names from the blacklist and the prisoner release and prisoner swap. If I were to ask you in terms of a list of priorities for the Taliban, how would you put that list of priority in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4?
I think number one priority is some sort of an agreement on the withdrawal of the foreign forces from Afghanistan. That is their most important demand. And they cannot really compromise on that, because the whole struggle, the fight since 17 years has been against foreign occupation, as they say. So that, I think, is number one. Other issues actually are mostly confidence-building measures. Okay. Release of Taliban prisoners, removal of Taliban names from the UN Security Council blacklist. These are confidence-building measures which will enable Taliban to tell their rank and file that, look, we have achieved this in the talks, and now we are trying to achieve more, especially the withdrawal of foreign forces. Amendments in the Afghan constitution, that I think is not a major issue, because, the two sides can discuss this, Afghan government and Taliban. That can come later. Sharia, enforcement of Sharia, the Taliban demand, which they keep making, I think that will also be discussed along with the amendments in the Afghan constitution. So I believe that, for Taliban, an issue on which they may not make any compromise is the withdrawal of foreign forces. They will want to have a timetable. It can be a bit longer also. It cannot be an immediate pullout. Everybody knows that. And the Americans actually would like the Afghan government to be involved in making these decisions. They will not do it alone, bypassing the Afghan government.
Okay, so basically what we are saying here is that the Taliban will go to their fighters on the ground and say, look, we've been fighting this occupation force for the last 17 years, and our primary goal was to get them out of here. And now they have said that they're going to withdraw, phased withdrawal from this moment to that moment over a period of 6 months or a year and a half. And therefore, now we have room to start talking to them, also agree to perhaps regional ceasefires, and perhaps also sit down with the Kabul government to start talking about power sharing, being part of the political configuration, and also perhaps a transitional government of some sort, which can sit down and review the constitution. Do you think that is the kind of roadmap that the Taliban are looking at? Because that's what I understand from your analysis.
I think, more or less that explains the whole thing. Once they have achieved this goal of getting the foreign forces out of Afghanistan, I think then they can have a roadmap, they can even change it, things can be, reoriented. This can happen, I think. But let me also add one thing more. There is also this wish or this hope by both sides. I mean, the U.S. and the Afghan government, maybe they have this belief that there will be division in Taliban ranks if they, go ahead and, make a peace agreement. So then that will make it easier to deal with Taliban if there are division in their ranks. Taliban also are hoping that if the Americans agree to withdraw, they can wait out that period, and maybe then the Afghan forces,
if that is the case, then I think both the sides are looking at the situation still in not so much in terms of negotiations, but more in terms of one-upmanship. But I will come back to that, Rahimullah Yousafzai, because that's a very important point. Given what Rahimullah Yousafzai has talked about, especially his last point, in terms of one-upmanship, with the Taliban assessing that if the Americans give a withdrawal timetable, then perhaps they can wait them out, and the Americans thinking that by pulling the Taliban into negotiations, they might be able to create some kind of dissent between the relative hardliners and the relative moderates. Would you agree with that point?
There is a campaign. Presidential election is coming in 2020, and President Trump wants their troops to take out them from Afghanistan, from Syria, to show the public that we brought our soldiers back home. And that's the part of the campaign. Definitely, they are evaluating it, and they will take out their 7,000 soldiers from Afghanistan. But first, they will agree on the ceasefire with the Taliban. Second, they will agree on to take out the Taliban's friend and elders from the blacklist. Third, they will agree on the power sharing.
But Wahidullah Ghazi, I agree with you. I mean, we discussed this before also about the prisoner release and swap and, non-blacklisting of the Taliban and the rest of it. And Rahimullah Yousafzai was saying that these are more confidence-building measures. The actual substantive issue is the withdrawal timetable. And once the withdrawal timetable has been announced, then perhaps one can get down to deciding ceasefire, the nature of the ceasefire, perhaps before an entire ceasefire, a complete ceasefire, regional ceasefires, and then, of course, talking to the Kabul government. Would you agree with that assessment?
As you see, since 3 months, we are seeing Taliban were successful because Taliban was asking that we are talking with the U.S. and they talked already with the U.S. 3-4 times in different countries. Taliban recognized by some countries like Moscow. They attending the Moscow conference, and I'm sure that they will be successful, and American will agree with Taliban.
Thank you, Wahidullah Ghazi, for your perspective. We have Wahid Majda, what your assessment of the current situation is with the presence in the region of Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think despite of a lot of hope, but this process is full of ambiguity because there was a lot of yip between the Taliban and American stand about Afghanistan. As mentioned, Mr. Wahid Ghazi, the main demand of Taliban is withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. In the first meeting, when Khalilzad had meeting with Taliban, he asked from Taliban, and Taliban told him about their demands. But in the second meeting, Mr. Khalilzad knows that it's impossible to convince Taliban to accept American demand. The main demand of Americans is talking Taliban with Afghan government and accept American bases in Afghanistan, at least one or two bases. But Taliban refused this, and after Khalilzad started to make pressure on Taliban by through the other countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And after that, we see Taliban are not agree with this, and there is they announced about their new stand. If they want to make pressure, they leave this. They postpone this talking, and this is a bad situation because there was a lot of hope, but after several decades.
Wait, this is very interesting. What you're saying is very interesting because, especially with reference to the U.S. keeping some of the troops or at least a couple of bases in Afghanistan, because as you might recall, about a couple of weeks ago, some parts of the Afghan media leaked one of the RAND papers, not in its entirety, but some of the salient points of the RAND paper, which gave a roadmap of sorts of what can possibly happen. And it did talk about the U.S. keeping a couple of bases. Do you think that this is what the United States wants, that while it withdraws the bulk of its remaining troops, it would still want a couple of bases to be kept, and it wants the Taliban to accept that? And as you were saying, the Taliban are absolutely not interested in that.
It's impossible for Taliban to accept just a single combat force of Americans inside Afghanistan, because they are fighting for, according to their announcement, they are fighting for freedom of Afghanistan, and foreign forces invade Afghanistan, and they never accept this. If Americans they accept American bases, I think it's a big problem inside Taliban, because the fighters, the people who fight for Taliban for a long time, and they sacrifice for this big aim and big goal. They think that their leaders are not honest people, and after that, I think most of this Taliban joined to other groups, or maybe joined to ISIS, and it's the end of Taliban. For this, I think it's impossible for Taliban leadership to accept presence of foreign forces in Afghanistan. It's impossible completely. And
okay, Wahid Mujda, that's a very important point. Stay with me. Let me go next to Rahimullah Yusufzai. Rahimullah Yusufzai, Wahid Mujda is making a very interesting point. He, just like you did, he has said that the first and the foremost requirement and the most substantive requirement for the Taliban at this point in time, or for that matter at any point in time in this phase of pre-negotiations, is the issue of the U.S. troop withdrawal. Now, if we accept, as I said, I mentioned the RAND Corporation report also, which you talked about on my program, and parts of which were leaked by the Afghan media. If the Americans are really insisting on withdrawing the bulk of their remaining forces, but keeping a couple of bases, that seems to me like a non-negotiating issue, because that will be a non-starter and the Taliban will never accept that.
Yes, I think that's the basic point. You know, the Taliban are saying all foreign forces should leave Afghanistan. That is their first and foremost demand, which means that if all foreign forces have to leave, you can't have any military base in Afghanistan. So if the Americans are thinking in those terms, I think that will not be acceptable to Taliban. The other thing is that, you know, the Americans will argue, and I think this is what the RAND Corporation report says, there will be a limited Afghanistan support group.
Yes.
Maybe with soldiers from different countries led by the US. And this will be ostensibly to fight terrorist groups. That could include, say, ISIS or Al-Qaeda or maybe some other groups. That I think is what, is the American idea, the American,
But
demand.
do you think that would fly
Yes,
with
so I
the
am
Taliban?
saying that Taliban would not accept that.
Yeah.
And that could become, that could even lead to the collapse of the talks. So, the Afghan government and the U.S. also have this strategic partnership agreement. They have a security pact, which, again could be a hurdle. Taliban may demand that this should be scrapped altogether, while the Afghan government would not agree to that. They still need support. They will say, I think they are aiming for, say, this decade of transition after the pullout of bulk of the foreign forces in December 2014. This decade is going to last until 2024. So they are
Absolutely.
expecting
I think
that there will be international support in some form or the other until 2024. And that is too long a period for Taliban to
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's too long a period. I'm going to take a short break, but before that, last question to Wahid Mujda. Wahid Mujda, tell me quickly, what is your prediction? I normally don't ask people to predict, but in the next month or so, do you think there's going to be another round of talks, or you think that it's going to take much longer than that?
I think if Americans insist in their presence in Afghanistan, I think the fourth round of talks is the final round of talks between Taliban and U.S. and Taliban never want to resume this kind of talks. But I want to say something because Mr. Survey say about the American Rand Corporation peace roadmap. When some Americans came here and talked about this from Rand Corporation, they told me something. It was very interesting. They says we are ready to withdraw from Afghanistan, but this withdrawal will be a condition withdrawal. Condition withdrawal means we never want to announce our the exact time for withdrawal of foreign forces, but at first Afghan Taliban and Afghan government should talk to each other, and they accept about the interim government in Afghanistan during the 18 months. During the 18 months, and after that, election in Afghanistan, and this election, the government which came from this election, it's elected by Afghan people in the transparent election. After that, this government can make decision about the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan.
Very interesting. Very interesting, Wahid Mujda. I'm afraid this is all the time I have right now before taking the break. Thank you so much for giving us your perspective. We're going to take a short break. At the other end of the break, we'll have a couple of other panelists to talk about the situation in Afghanistan while Rahimullah Yousafzai stays with us. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of the situation in Afghanistan, the pre-negotiation phase, of course, and the fact that Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad is once again in the region, staying 5 days in Pakistan. There's a lot of pressure on the Taliban from Islamabad, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and perhaps China to talk to the government in Kabul. But as my panelists assessed, the primary and substantive issue has to do with the troop withdrawal timetable by the United States, and that is something which has not come forth as yet. And therefore, some of the other confidence-building measures like delisting and prisoner release and swap and the rest of it does not really matter. Neither does the issue of the Taliban sitting vis-a-vis from the Afghan government in Kabul until the troop withdrawal timetable is discussed or can be worked out. And I still have Rahimullah Yousafzai with me, but I'm joined by former Major General Saad Khattak and also James Dorsey, who is an analyst and writer based in Singapore. Saad, thank you so much for being on the program. What is your assessment of the situation? Would you agree with other panelists that I had on the program before I got to you that the primary and foremost substantive issue is about the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, Ejaz, thank you very much for having me on your program. I absolutely agree that the Taliban are stuck to their two-point stance. One, withdrawal of the foreign troops from the Afghanistan soil, and the other is talking directly to the United States rather than Afghan government, which they consider as a puppet government, which they consider as a government that cannot take independent decisions. So I think it's very difficult. It's very good to be an optimist, but I'm sorry to say it's very hard to be an optimist here. If I have to give you my view of things for having the things moving forward, it just my take personally. If the U.S. somehow expand the intra-Afghan dialogue to be broadened more rather than restricting and asking the Taliban to talk to the Afghan government, involving more of the Afghan people because of the society there, I think, and very less representation, of course, to the government side, I think there may be an idea that the Taliban will consider the idea. And the second thing that you talked about is the troops withdrawal. There has to be an understanding in one form or the other given to the Taliban people to, that they are going. The third thing is that as we talk now, there are Afghan people, both civilians and Taliban, getting killed in Afghanistan today and yesterday. So that's also simultaneous. So effort by the US also, in Afghanistan to bring in, as we have been viewing, we bring in India into Afghanistan. That has not been taken very positively in Pakistan. So what I am saying is that the U.S. has to be very sincere, that it has to see whether Pakistan's relevance in this quagmire solution is more important to it than bringing in other stakeholders, which perhaps doesn't have any stake in Afghanistan. So what I would like to say is that this dialogue process needs to get expanded, and they have to give some sort of a reassurance to the Taliban that they need to, withdraw from Afghanistan, and at the same time, a greater say to the Afghan people in general, because as we speak now, as I said, people are getting killed. The Taliban are getting on the offensive. They are getting more and more area. So they have the negotiating strength on their side.
Okay, Saad, I'm happy you talked about India because interestingly enough, the official spokesperson, Dr. Mohammad Faisal, in his weekly press briefing said that Pakistan does not envisage any role for India, which, interestingly enough, was in sharp contrast to a statement made by the foreign minister about a month ago to the National Assembly, where he talked about the fact that India is there in Afghanistan and we will perhaps need to get India's cooperation to move forward in terms of peace and reconciliation. So how do we square these two contradictory statements, one by the foreign minister and one yesterday by the official spokesperson?
Which is more relevant to them. It shouldn't have been that way, but I think that if India is given the place and position more than perhaps that it really deserves in Afghanistan, given its geography, given its entire sort of impact there, I think that is not going to be taken positively, regardless of what the foreign minister or the spokesman of the foreign ministry says. This is for the people of Pakistan. They consider India not having that importance in Afghanistan or with the Afghan people as the people of Pakistan and the society in Pakistan has.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Major General Saad talking to us, giving his perspective. Let me pull in James here. James, you write about South Asia, West Asia, the Greater Middle East. What is your assessment of where the situation stands?
the issue of the troop withdrawals is really a reflection of a much deeper problem. And that is that if you leave the Saudis and the Emiratis out of the equation for 1 minute, you have four parties: the United States, Pakistan, the Taliban, and the Afghan government, who, one, do not trust each other, and two, are not quite sure what the other wants. So, with other words, you have the United States, which has proven to be, under President Trump, an unpredictable and unreliable partner that can change of opinion very quickly. Look at the question of the troop withdrawal in Syria. You have the Taliban, who see that and envision a situation in which they will be stronger if there is a troop withdrawal. You have an Afghan government and the Taliban who don't want to talk to each other.
I'm sure as an analyst, you know that in negotiations or in the pre-negotiation phase, or when you're dealing with a situation which is perhaps become a wicked problem, everyone who is negotiating on the basis of their interests will obviously not really put their optimal choices on the table, and perhaps present a suboptimal choice if we put it in a game theoretic model in order to get concessions from the other parties and push them towards the optimal choices of that actor.
It's not just about a negotiating tactic that I was talking about. I was talking about defining what various institutions or groups within a given country define as the country's fundamental interest, and that may be different. Now, on the issue of stability, absolutely, you're right. The conflict in Afghanistan contributes to issues and problems and instability in Pakistan itself. But we would be reducing the problem, oversimplifying the problem, if we would reduce it to that, which by definition means that in the trade-off of interests, some interests in Pakistan believe that a degree of instability is a price to pay for something that they think is more important.
That's correct. But I would, if you allow me, I would put it slightly differently, perhaps. It is easier to deal with a relatively weak government rather than a place which is unstable to a certain degree. But stay with me, James. We've also been joined by Ambassador Aziz Khan, who was our ambassador to Afghanistan at a time when the Taliban were in sway in at least 95% of the Afghan area. Ambassador Khan, thank you so much for joining us. Just give me a quick assessment of where do you think the situation stands with, of course, the backdrop being the Afghan peace and reconciliation, Zalmay Khalilzad being on a regional tour and staying in Pakistan for 5 days, and the Afghans saying that we are not prepared to talk to the Kabul government, and the Americans have still to give a troop withdrawal timetable, which is, as per the assessment of my panelists earlier, is the primary, foremost, and the substantive issue that the Taliban are interested in.
Well, the Taliban have taken this position right from the start that they're only going to talk to the Americans, and they're going to discuss the withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan. Of course, the issue is much larger than that. And Pakistan's position has been, and has been the position of nearly the entire international community, that peace in Afghanistan can only be established through a negotiating process in which both Afghan government and the Taliban are involved, or the much often repeated Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process. And I think, to me personally, it is quite clear that a lasting peace in Afghanistan can only come when all parties are involved in the negotiations and all parties are agreed to the final formula that is agreed upon.
Okay, Ambassador Khan, stay with me. I have to pull in Rahimullah Yousafzai. He's been listening to my analysts since after the break. Rahimullah Yousafzai, you've heard what James Dorsey said, what Journalist Saad Khattak said, and now what Ambassador Aziz Khan is saying. Any agreement or any disagreement to what the other panelists have been saying?
Basically, it has to be a compromise between all the Afghan groups and all the Afghan people. And as we know, we have a unity government in Afghanistan, even though it may be weak and vulnerable. But, the Afghan government, represents, say, the Afghan people. They have a parliament. There are divisions even in Afghanistan. I mean, the people who support the Afghan government. So we have these, opposition parties which have formed their own negotiating teams to talk to Taliban. They don't trust the Afghan government. So it's going to be a messy affair, Ijaz, with all these people talking to each other and disagreeing, I think, on everything. And then the Taliban on one side and the Afghan government and the Afghan opposition and the Americans and then the regional players and the global powers. I think that's why the situation is so complicated. It has become so complex. And there will be, hurdles in every round of meeting, on every step. If we are looking for a grand reconciliation, that's very idealistic. I don't think that can happen. So we should be trying that the Afghan government, which represents, say, the will of the Afghan people, because Ashraf Ghani was elected and Abdullah was the runner-up. And then the Taliban, if they can talk, with the Americans also getting involved, and then Pakistan and other countries playing the role of the observer, that would be, I think, the right, formula. Because we cannot wait for all these Afghan groups to agree on something. They haven't agreed on anything in the past 40 years.
Okay, that's not a very optimistic scenario, but thank you so much, Rahimullah Yusufzai, for being with us and giving us your insights. Ambassador Khan, the Afghans, according to Rahimullah Yusufzai, haven't agreed on anything in the last 40 years. So why should we, so the implication being, why should we now be optimistic that they're likely to do that? Do you share that assessment?
Yes, the situation is very complex and very difficult, and there is not much hope for optimism, but we have no other choice but to keep striving for some kind of a reconciliation between the different parties in Afghanistan. And I agree with Rahimullah that the Afghan government represents, the unity government represents the Afghan people. It has come through elections. Next elections are going to be held in May, I think. And the Afghan Taliban have to talk to this government for a reconciliation. If the Afghan Taliban think that by just seeking withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan, the problem will be resolved, I think they are also not being absolutely.
I think that is a precondition to start negotiating. But thank you so much, Ambassador Aziz Ahmed Khan was talking to us. James Dorsey, before I wrap up, give me a sense of, I don't like predictions, but I'm going to force you nonetheless into predicting something. In the next month or couple of months, where do you think the situation is headed in terms of the pre-negotiation phase?
You can certainly try, and I'll try to respond. I would share the pessimism of my fellow colleagues on the panel. I think there's an incentive to talk. I don't think there's an incentive to come to a rapid agreement. I think that certainly the Taliban, among others, will want to wait and see what happens, including what happens in Washington and what happens in Kabul and Islamabad. So I think that everybody has an interest in keeping the process going, but not necessarily in the process truly and substantially moving forward.
So you're basically saying that Zalmay Khalilzad, whose remit it is to bring peace and reconciliation and who is on a clock, essentially by April, we had assessed earlier in a program a couple of weeks ago that is very unlikely to happen because it seems that the pre-negotiation phase itself could well go up until fall of this year, and unless and if it is successful, to a certain degree that the negotiations are unlikely to begin before the spring of 2020. Is that your assessment also? Would you agree with that sort of sense of the timeline?
I don't want to put a timeline on it, but let me throw a joker into this, if you wish. And that is, I have no idea what President Trump really thinks about Afghanistan. We've seen the example of Syria,
yes,
where he's basically said it's death and destruction. What am I doing there?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the process of withdrawal has been prolonged. We don't know yet for sure what the impact is of the death of the 4 soldiers in Manjib this week. And in many ways, Afghanistan could be a very similar process. With other words, I don't know truly whether he thinks Afghanistan is important or whether he looks at this as one more burden that he has inherited from the Obama and other previous administrations, and it's simply a headache he wants to get rid of, but also has bureaucratic obstacles within his own administration.
Correct. I agree with you, James Dorsey. This is all the time we have for today. We shall see you on Indus Special next week. Until then, it's goodbye.